Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 306, the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Once the ink was dry on the Treaty of Saint-Germain, Catherine went back to her favorite pastime, arranging marriage matches for her remaining children. The biggest catch remained the Princess Margot, who was beautiful, alluring, and also a princess. Philip of Spain wanted to marry her to the Portuguese king, who seemed much more interested in reading Sir Thomas Aquinas, he literally went nowhere without it, than talking to women. But Philip hoped that the match would keep Catherine firmly in the ultra-Catholic camp and away from Protestant temptation. This, of course, annoyed the remaining leading French Huguenots at court. But proving that this had nothing to do with religion at all, Catherine decided instead to pursue a match between Henri, the Duke of Anjou, and Elizabeth I of England. Elizabeth, recall, was 2 decades older than Anjou, and Anjou had absolutely no interest in being married to a heretic 20 years his senior, and he put the kibosh on the whole idea. But in at least one respect, Catherine had some success. On November the 25th, 1570, Elizabeth of Austria, Charles IX's proposed bride, reached France. Catherine wanted their wedding to be magnificent, despite the reality that her treasury was already empty and a war-torn France certainly could not afford it. Now, unbeknownst to the newly arrived Elizabeth, Charles had a mistress in Paris named Marie Truchot, the daughter of a bourgeoisie Protestant. He had decided that he loved Marie from their first encounter in Orleans back in 1569, and had carried on a secret love affair for many months during that summer. A portrait of her shows a girl with strawberry blonde hair and a pretty round face. Charles entrusted his secret to Margot and asked her to take Marie into her household as one of her ladies. As the courtiers amused themselves during the summer evenings, the king's personal guard would, at his single, played tambourines and pipes to create a noisy commotion, allowing him to escape and meet with his mistress. One day, he gave her a piece of paper upon which he had written, "Le Champ Teuf." Marie asked what it meant, and Margot explained that he had created an anagram for her name. When the court returned to Paris, Catherine discovered the relationship, and after making inquiries about the girl, approved of this liaison. She harbored no aspirations whatsoever to control Charles or detach him from her, and so this girl was perfectly acceptable to Catherine. The king's mistress was nowhere close to what Catherine had experienced with Diane de Poitiers. In fact, she proved to be a completely benign influence upon the king, and bore him a baby son, whom they named after his father, always known as the Petit Charles. He became a particular favorite, interestingly enough, among Catherine's grandchildren, and was later given the title the Duke of Angoulême. Petit Charles was notable among Catherine's descendants for his longevity. He clearly inherited a strong constitution from his mother and actually survived well into the reign of Louis XIV. Always being conscious of being the son of a king, Petit Charles was nevertheless careful never to annoy anyone, particularly Louis, and behaved courteously towards him. But of course, understandably, Louis XIV considered Angoulême to be a relic of the past. Now, despite this affair, Charles very much loved his new wife, Elizabeth. She was a saintly woman who went to Mass twice per day and spent many more hours at prayer. Charles and Elizabeth first entered the capital together on March the 6th, 1571. Catherine, despite a lack of funds, had spared no expense. In fact, she had mortgaged her own jewelry to pay for much of the pageantry. During the wedding ceremony, Charles's procession stopped at the Notre Dame Cathedral, where there was an enormous banquet. On March the 11th, Charles gave a speech to the Parliament of Paris, in which he paid eloquent homage to his mothers, telling his listeners, quote, "After God, the Queen my mother is the person to whom I am the most indebted. Her tenderness for me and for my people, her tireless work, energy, and wisdom have assured the running of state affairs so well during a time when, because of my age, I was unable to take charge of them myself, that even the tempests of civil war have been unable to harm my kingdom." End quote. This tribute, of course, had been orchestrated like everything else in the celebrations by Catherine herself, and it also contained the veiled message that she would continue to keep charge of state affairs, if always standing politely and tactfully a few paces behind her son. Despite the king's talk of his mother's success in guarding the kingdom during the civil wars, the unsurprising but glaring absence of the Huguenot princes and other nobles holed up in La Rochelle was duly noted. Elizabeth herself was crowned at Saint-Denis on March the 25th, 1571. Meanwhile, affairs abroad had gotten slightly more serious. In early 1571, William of Orange attempted to build up a coalition of forces from Germany to liberate the Netherlands. Orange's brother, Louis of Nassau, was at La Rochelle, where he hoped French Protestants might lend their military support. And Charles, for his part, when he got word of it, thought this might be a good chance to lead his troops into some real military action. Catherine did her best now to walk a diplomatic tightrope. Flemish rebels had been using La Rochelle as a base from which to assault Spanish shipping. Catherine was willing to look the other way about this, as it gained her support amongst her Protestant nobility. But she didn't want these attacks to go so far as to instigate a war with Spain. She knew that would be an abject disaster to be avoided at all costs. But the problem was that increasingly, Catherine found her efforts undermined by the actions of her own son. Charles now wanted to make foreign policy decisions for himself. The problem was, he was both terrible at it and even worse at keeping his stratagems secret. Everyone knew what he was doing long before he did it. Case in point, Tuscany. The Pope had recently given Tuscany to Cosimo de' Medici, a family relation of Catherine, but one whom she despised. The Habsburgs were incensed at the Pope's pretensions, given that Tuscany was traditionally imperial territory. To defend his new land, Cosimo reached out to Charles, who quickly agreed to an anti-Spanish, anti-Habsburg alliance, though it gave him nothing and only committed his forces to more conflicts than his kingdom could handle. Worse still, Charles didn't keep any of this secret, so Philip of Spain knew exactly where the King of France stood. And neither did this work out for Cosimo, by the way. He quickly realized Charles had no idea what he was doing. And so when Charles tried to use this pact offensively instead of the defensive alliance it was supposed to be, Cosimo wrote frantically, urging the young king to follow his mother's advice, since Cosimo clearly saw this alliance as defensive, while Charles thought the two had agreed to some sort of a blank check alliance. Charles continued negotiating with the Protestants in La Rochelle, who wanted him to invade the Netherlands alongside Louis of Nassau. The idea, at least as it was being pitched, was to liberate the territory from the Spanish, give most of it to the native Dutch who were Protestants, and then a small section of border territory would be ceded to France. It was all the height of naivete, but Charles was all in on it. To Catherine, this was anathema. Her entire goal since the death of her husband had been to avoid foreign wars, especially with Spain, whose Mexican and Peruvian possessions continued, for the moment, to function as Philip's personal ATM. Peace abroad, stability at home. Those were Catherine's mantras. Thus far, she had only ever succeeded at the former. Charles looked to undo even that. Now, Catherine was fine entertaining everybody else's wild ambitions, so long as that bought her time and peace. She just didn't want France to commit to anything major. When the Spanish heard about Charles's not-so-secret deal with the Dutch rebels, Philip was furious and declared in no uncertain terms that this was going to lead directly to war. Now, after repeated promises of safe conduct, Coligny finally left La Rochelle and made the trek to Blois in September 1571. Catherine was desperate to get the admiral back into the fold, to get him back at the royal council. La Rochelle was now essentially a politically independent enclave in France, and that was by no means good for the kingdom. Catherine also needed to get it back under royal control, and to do that, she needed Coligny. Charles spent the next several weeks showering the old admiral with gifts and studiously returning all his lost properties. Now, simultaneously, word reached the court at Blois that Cosimo was no longer interested in fighting the Spanish in the Netherlands. He had, in fact, joined in the ongoing war against the Ottoman Turks and recently taken part in the massively important Battle of Lepanto. The Ottomans will actually be the subject of our next episode, as much has gone on in that direction since the death of Suleiman the Magnificent. Catherine was overjoyed, as she had been looking on any excuse to pump the brakes on the Dutch problem. Charles was exuberant when he heard news of Lepanto. That was, at least, until someone reminded him that most of the Turkish fleet had actually been on loan from France. Hence, the losses were actually French ships. That deflated the mood at court a bit, though Charles remained seemingly intent on invading the Netherlands, though literally everyone at court told him that was a terrible idea. Meanwhile, in Paris, the mood remained tense. The Guise faction continued to be absent. Coligny seemed to be back in the royal good graces, though the staunchly Catholic Queen Elizabeth recoiled from his presence as though the old warrior were Satan himself. Coligny was probably the only person now at court who wanted Charles's invasion of the Netherlands to go forward. In late 1571, the plot to assassinate Elizabeth I of England and place Mary Stuart on the throne fell apart, as we know. But the upshot of the whole affair was to shift foreign policy in France, because England was driven closer to France in an anti-Spanish alliance. Charles was keen for such a match, and though Anjou could no longer be thrown in as a marital prospect for the English queen, his younger brother Francois might serve the purpose. Plus, Charles detested his younger brother and was happy to see him off if Elizabeth would take him. As usual, Elizabeth dawdled and allowed the talks to proceed while refusing a definite answer. The discussions did result in the Treaty of Blois in 1572, however. This was essentially a defensive and a commercial pact. Elizabeth's value as an ally became doubtful when the French discovered that she had secretly also opened discussions with the Duke of Alba at his request, only a month before signing the Treaty of Blois, with the aim of restoring commercial relations between England and the Spanish Netherlands. These had been suspended in 1569 and were proving costly to both countries. Although the English had found other outlets in Hamburg, their traditional and commercial associations with the Netherlands were mutually profitable and preferable. By 1572, Spanish shipping suffered severe interruptions due to the constant attack from William of Orange's privateers. The sea beggars, as they were known, successfully roved the English Channel, capturing or sinking a large number of enemy ships, with their cargoes taking refuge at La Rochelle and various English ports. In order for her agreement with Alba to proceed, Elizabeth had already in February 1572 ordered all the rebel ships to leave English ports. Their expulsion set off an unforeseen change of events that would inflame the already aggravated situation in the Low Countries and encourage French Protestants to believe in the ultimate possibility of a successful invasion to eject the Spaniards altogether. The sea beggars had put out to sea, but were forced by a storm to drop anchor at Briel in the Netherlands. By chance, the Spanish garrison there had recently departed to put down a rebellion in Utrecht, and the sea beggars, a highly organized military and naval force, captured the port. It didn't take long before they controlled most of the Zeeland Peninsula. Large numbers of refugees in England and La Rochelle now hurried to join them, boosted by special clandestine forces from England and other sympathetic states. On the 30th of April, the very day after the signing of the Treaty of Blois, the English announced that commercial relations with Flanders would recommence. Elizabeth, who didn't want triumph for either France or Spain, followed her own strategy of keeping the Spanish tied up in the Netherlands, the French tempted to intervene and Philip unable to concentrate on invading England's quote-unquote heretical shores. Still, despite all of this, Catherine's primary focus in 1572 remained arranging a marital pact between the House of Navarre and the House of Valois. This meant a marriage between Henri of Navarre and the Princess Margot. To that end, on March 2, 1572, Queen Jean of Navarre, a staunch Protestant, finally agreed to visit the royal court at Blois and discuss the matter in person. Both Henri and Margot, by the way, were essentially unwilling participants in this affair, but pawns do not get to dictate their course, and so onward they march. As was usual during the 16th century, the negotiations focused around religion. Essentially, both sides were waiting for a papal dispensation that would allow the Protestant Henri to wed the Catholic Margot. Charles finally got tired of waiting, however, and granted Henri the right to have a proxy stand in for the Catholic portion of the wedding, though he would at least have to be in Paris for the ceremony. On April 11, 1572, the two sides formally signed the marriage contract. But then disaster struck. Jean of Navarre fell ill, and on the June 9th, at the age of only 44, she died. Her death was a huge blow to the Huguenots, though later rumors that Catherine had been behind her death make no sense at all. After all, on May 13th, a new pope, Gregory XIII, was elected, and he was much more amenable to a union between Navarre and France, which supports what Catherine wanted in the first place. But then events intervened that once more turned up the international temperature between France and Spain. On July 17, 1572, a Huguenot military expedition of 5,000 troops crossed the border from France into the Spanish Netherlands, where they were then ambushed near Mons by Spanish troops who had been alerted about the attack well in advance. The Protestant captains were on a mission to save Louis of Nassau, who had, with the support of money and men from Charles, attacked Mons and Valenciennes. Initial success had quickly turned to failure, and the Spanish now had Nassau and his men besieged in the fortress of Mons. At the same time, Prince William of Orange, Nassau's brother, planned an invasion from Germany. For weeks, rumors had been circulating at the French court about the rescue plan. Parisian armorers were reportedly working throughout the night, and every day since mid-June, large numbers of armed men had been seen leaving Paris, heading north. Some alleged that the king personally received some of the Huguenot captains in Paris on or about the 23rd of June. Charles, for his part, however, claimed total ignorance of the attack, though it's hard to credit that since the Spanish were well informed enough to prevent its success. It's most likely that the Huguenots had the clandestine help of Coligny and at least the tacit support of the king. Regardless, the Huguenot force was decimated. Only a few hundred men escaped. One of the survivors was one of the Huguenot captains, Genlis. He, unfortunately, carried a highly compromising letter written by Charles in which he encouraged the French Huguenots in their rebellious activities in the Netherlands. The incursion of an armed force into Spanish territory could easily constitute an act of war by the French, and Charles hastily distanced himself by congratulating Philip on his success in defeating the expedition so roundly. Catherine, furious that her son had covertly supported so foolish a mission, demanded he make a public declaration denouncing the expedition stating that his aim was to live in harmony with his neighbors. Believing that the immediate crisis now had been averted, Catherine left the capital to tend to her daughter Claude, where she had been taken ill on the way to Paris. She was coming for the wedding. Catherine, though, had failed to grasp that as far as Coligny was concerned, this expedition, the failed one, represented little more than an advanced party for what would later be a far greater French force that he planned to lead. And no sooner had Catherine turned her back on the capital than he had the king's ear, trying to convince him of the wisdom of this plan. Catherine got wind of this and rushed back to Paris to implore her son to avoid war with Spain. She insisted that such a course would undo everything she had worked so hard for and turn the country over to the Protestants. Coligny argued that the advance should go forward, and the king found himself torn between his mother and his mentor. At the emergency council meeting on the 9th and 10th of August, all those present, which included Anjou, the Dukes of Nevers and Montpellier, the Marshals Cossé and Tavarez, all voted for peace. The only dissenting voice, Coligny. At the outcome of the vote, Coligny is said to have given a rather sinister warning to the victorious Catherine, quote, "Madame, if the king decides against a war, may God spare him another from which he will not be able to extricate himself. I am not able to oppose that which your majesty has done, but I am assured that she will have occasion to regret it." End quote. This was clearly intended as a warning, but by making this barely veiled threat, Coligny had just unwittingly signed his own death warrant. Catherine now prepared to take drastic measures to protect both her son's throne and the peace of the kingdom. The ensuing tumultuous events of August of 1572 are the ones that have stained her name for, about 440 years now, creating this sort of legend of the Black Queen. Unfortunately, she's not remembered for her enlightened and often frequent attempts at conciliation between Protestants and Catholics, but only for the chaotic bloodbath that, as we'll see today, becomes known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. After the council meeting on August the 10th, 1572, Catherine prepared to visit her daughter Claude, who was recovering from an illness. According to memoirs written 20 years later, the king absolutely begged her not to go. He was, according to one source, petrified at the idea his mother would, quote-unquote, abandon him as the Huguenots rallied for a final attack. This memoir, of course, has the value of hindsight. Charles actually physically pursued his mother as she readied to depart, begging her to reconsider. Our sources report that this is when she made her move. Sensing that Charles would agree to anything to keep her support, she played her trump card. For the good of the nation, Coligny must die. There was no desire for personal vengeance in this decision. This decision, from her perspective, was to restore France to some semblance of normality. Now, at the same time that this is going on, Coligny was dismissing all the advice he was getting not to go to Paris for Henri of Navarre's wedding. Coligny wouldn't listen to any of it. Even if he died, he declared, he had lived long enough. At this point, the admiral had clearly become the very caricature of a biblical martyr. On July the 1st, Henri of Navarre attended his mother's funeral. He made it to Paris on the 8th. There was no question of postponing this wedding. The marriage of the Protestant prince to the Catholic princess simply had to go forward. Physically, Henri was certainly no tall blonde compared with the young Duke of Guise, whom Margot had previously had an affair, but he was still considered very attractive in the age. He was about 5 feet 8 inches tall. He had a high forehead, thick dark hair, clear skin, and a prominent nose That was a feature of the Bourbons. He used to spend much of his time on horseback, was quite muscular, and was, in terms of his nature, cheerful, outgoing, and generous. He had grown, frankly, into a very open and straightforward man. He had a particular charm as a result of that, really from his frankness, his masculinity, and oftentimes his magnanimity as well. His physical attributes were matched by his intellect. He was not, as so many courtiers like to claim, an inarticulate, foolish peasant from the Pyrenees. Notwithstanding a love of garlic and a distaste for bathing, he could joke and talk with those surrounding him without losing the composure required of a prince of the blood. He combined being a man and a king with surprising social finesse. Despite himself, Charles had always liked Navarre. He could not help but be attracted to him. Henri had seen real military action, and that made a robust and good companion for the king. Frankly, the king found him refreshing after the ludicrous affectations of his own brother Anjou. Now, in the days leading up to the wedding in Paris, the streets were oppressively hot and, quite frankly, choked with people. It had been a very poor harvest that year, so peasants had flooded to the city, hoping to take advantage of the planned wedding feasts. As the first Protestants arrived, they found the city, unexpectedly, welcoming. Yet around the middle of July, the mood decisively changed. Then the Catholic pulpits came alive with sermons lambasting this proposed union as diabolical. Suddenly, the very city seemed to grow hot, both due to the unusual heat wave and also the seething anger of its populace. It had become, in other words, a powder keg. Catherine returned to this hot, ill-tempered city on the 15th of August. Almost as soon as she arrived, she found herself confronted with a furious demand from the Spanish ambassador requiring an urgent explanation as to why no fewer than 3,000 Huguenot troops were stationed close to the border near Mons by the Netherlands. Once again, she had been fooled. As Catherine quickly discovered, the admiral had continued levying troops, despite the decision of the council. And at that very moment, he was raising a force of 12,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, intending to use it in the Netherlands. Nor was it a secret that the large number of Huguenot gentlemen in Paris for the wedding intended to set out for the Netherlands as soon as the celebrations ended. The admiral's ultimate intention was to lead a mixed force of Catholics and Protestants to fight in the Netherlands against Spain, and he believed that would remove the risk of civil war in Spain. The king was now too weak to wrest control of all this back from Coligny, and frankly, it's hard to even determine what the king wanted. He might not even have known. It's almost impossible to determine just when and how the plan to murder Coligny came into being. Certainly, the arrival of the Guise family into Paris provided Catherine with an enormous amount of accomplices, or I guess at least potential accomplices. It appears at some point the linchpin was the Duchess of Nemours, Anne d'Este. She agreed to participate in the admiral's death, and her involvement seems to have spurred the involvement of multiple other individuals. One thing is absolutely clear from the record. In early August, the Queen revoked the royal ban preventing the Guises from seeking their vengeance. Now, secrecy was still paramount. In the end, only 4 members of the entire Guise family were in on the plot. I have to point out what a risky plan this was. There were thousands of armed Huguenots in the city. If the plan failed and Coligny survived, there might have been a massacre, but it would have gone in the other direction. Once all the accomplices were had, and I'm not going to go through all of them because it's a lot of names, the only matter was in finding the actual assassin. Ultimately, the plotters picked a man by the name of Charles de Louvre. Incidentally, de Louvre de Marvaret had shot and killed one of Coligny's close friends during the recent third religious war. Everyone knew that he hated Coligny, and everyone knew he could keep his composure, so Catherine felt secure in this decision. She and King Charles would have clear alibis. Maurevert would shoot Coligny from the window of a residency owned by the Guise family, who then would clearly be blamed for the whole affair, or at least such was the plan. Frankly, there's a scenario here where Coligny is murdered, and then the Protestant crowns turn on and kill the entire Guise family that's present, which would have been nothing less than ideal for Catherine. In one fell swoop, she would have eliminated both of her rivals for power. One thing that was critical, however, was that the wedding had to take place before the murder. This wedding was to symbolize religious unity that would not be possible after Coligny was dead. On August the 16th, the Cardinal de Bourbon officiated the betrothal ceremony. The wedding was to take place 2 days later. On August the 18th, 1572, the 19-year-old bride readied herself for a ceremony she was not looking forward to. The Princess Margot had been given no say in this marriage and would maintain that truth until the end of her life. It was a rather bizarre ceremony. Coligny and the groom, Henri, watched from a distance as a proxy made the marriage promises for him. The moment the ceremony was over, Henri collected his new wife and set out for the palace for a feast. Despite all the tensions leading up to the wedding, the celebrations afterwards were, according to everyone, surprisingly good-natured. For the most part, the Admiral de Coligny was lodged at the Hôtel de Béziers. He kept his appearances and wedding entertainments to a minimum, and wrote to his wife on the evening of August the 18th as follows, quote, "Madame, today the marriage of Madame the sister of the King and the King of Navarre was celebrated. There will follow 3 or 4 days of celebrations, masques, and combats. After these, the King had assured and promised me that he will give me some time to deal with several complaints about breaches in the Edict of Amboise, from all around the kingdom. If I thought of nothing but my own happiness, I would rather come to see you than be at this court, for many reasons which I will tell you. But one must look after the people before one looks after oneself." There's actually a little postscript at the bottom of the letter that reads as follows. "Let me know how the little man or little girl is doing. 3 days ago I had an attack of colic, partly wind, partly gravel, but thank God it lasted only 8 or 10 hours, and today I feel no effect of it, thanks be to God. And I promise you that I shall not be much in evidence during all these feasts and combats during the next few days." End quote. You see, Coligny's wife was due to give birth any day now. Now, most high-ranking Protestants left the city almost immediately after the wedding. Coligny did not. On August the 10th, Charles had told him that he had, quote, "no confidence," end quote, in the Guise faction, and so he had ordered an additional 1,200 royal troops into the city. Now, the reason that Coligny was remaining in Paris was that he still wanted Charles to agree to an invasion of the Netherlands. But now Charles, stuck between the admiral and his mother, apparently couldn't make up his mind. What now follows has been the subject of speculation for about 400 years. One thing is certain. Catherine de' Medici played a leading role in setting of the chain of events in motion that's going to culminate in the bloodiest massacre in French history all the way up to the French Revolution. Late that night, as the last of the marriage revelries took place, it is believed that the Queen Mother held a meeting that included the following: the Duke of Anjou, Guise, his uncle Dumais, the Duke of Nemours, the Marshal Tavannes, and they all examined the plan for tomorrow in great detail. While the conspirators were talking, the assassin, Mauvert, was let into the house that was designed for the actual event to take place. The house was located, critically, on the exact route that the admiral would be taking in the morning to and from the council meetings at the Louvre Palace. On the morning of Friday, the 22nd of August, the government recess for the marriage celebrations being now over, the Admiral de Coligny left his lodgings on the Rue de Béthisy for a council meeting that was to start at 9 o'clock. He had wished to press for French military intervention in Flanders, but to his frustration, he found Anjou presiding over the meeting, as the king had gotten up rather late. Anjou left the meeting early, and when matters had been concluded, the admiral happened to come across the king on his way with a gentleman by the name of Téligny, the Duke of Guise, to play a game of tennis. Charles actually begged Coligny to join him for a game, but the admiral refused. They parted each other at around 11 o'clock in the morning. From there, Coligny left the Louvre for his short walk home, reading a document while he was walking. As he approached the window at which Mauvert was hiding behind a binding, one of his shoes happened to come loose. As he bent down to fix it, a shot rang out. The bullet broke his left arm and almost tore the index finger off his right hand. Had he not bent over at the critical moment, Coligny would have been killed almost instantly. Now a huge commotion ensued. Having first ensured that the admiral had not been dangerously hurt, a number of his gentlemen ran into the building from which they had heard the shot. They found a smoking arquebus behind the latticed window, but the would-be killer had already made his escape through a back door, where he had a horse waiting. Two Huguenot officers tore off after him. Coligny, who had fainted now due to the pain, was carried back to his lodgings. Meanwhile, word of the failed assassination attempt reached Catherine, just as she sat down to meet with the Spanish ambassador. Her face remained impassive as a messenger whispered the words in her ear. Betraying nothing, Catherine and the Duke of Anjou, who was also present, quietly got up and walked to her private apartments. King Charles, for his part, stood arguing on the tennis court over a point when suddenly he heard what had happened from two Huguenot captains. Throwing down his racket in a rage, he said to have exclaimed, "Am I never to be left in peace? More trouble, and then stormed off to his room. Here, his brother-in-law, Navarre, as well as Condé and other senior Huguenots, soon appeared and confronted him, demanding justice. Now, sending Ambroise Paré, the famous surgeon who had tried to save his father actually back in 1559 to Coligny, the king made three important declarations to show his good faith. He promised a full investigation into the crime, saying that the guilty parties, whoever they were, would be brought to justice. He forbade the citizens of Paris to take up arms, and he ordered that the area around the admiral be cleared of Catholics so that he would be surrounded only by his own men. The Duke of Guise wisely decided to leave the Louvre and go to his family, while the king busily issued orders. Meanwhile, the scene in Coligny's room was chaotic. According to a reliable witness, the doctor, Paré, arrived quickly and set to work on the admiral's wound. Operating first on the dangling finger, it took three gruesome attempts before he managed to cut the finger off, quote, as his scissors were not well sharpened. Then he moved on to attend to the injured arm. 2 deep incisions were made, and the bullet was mercifully extracted without endless probing. Crowding around his bed, Coligny's men gasped and wept. Their leader, maintaining his characteristic heroic composure, managed not only to keep from uttering the slightest groan, but even could find words of comfort for his dismayed men. As the word spread across the city of this attempted murder, a number of worried and angry Huguenots began to congregate outside Coligny's home. And they grew so rapidly that soon it was impossible to get in or out of the house. Now that afternoon, the king himself paid a visit to Coligny, and stood by his sickbed, swearing outrage and vengeance on all involved. Showing no sign of the immense hypocrisy that the situation actually called for, the Queen Mother and Anjou, who had both accompanied the king, swore the same, striving to outdo Charles in their levels of patently false indignation. The two were slightly less pleased in appearance when the king ordered again a full and immediate inquest into the attempted assassination. Anjou later recalled as follows: "We, Catherine and Anjou, quietly quitted the bed and stood in the middle of the chamber where we remained during this private colloquy, which gave us great suspicion and unease. Moreover, we saw ourselves surrounded by more than 200 partisans of the admiral. These all had melancholy countenances, and showed by their gestures and signs how disaffected they were. Some whispered, others did nothing, but passed behind us and before us, and omitted to pay us the honor and reverence which were our due, as if they suspected us of causing the wound of the admiral, which, of course, they had. The Queen, my mother, has since acknowledged that she never found herself in a more critical position." End quote. Catherine quickly intervened in the king's conversation with Coligny, desperate that Charles not put two and two together and realize that those standing beside the sickbed were the same two who had put Coligny in it. As soon as the trio left, the Huguenots started to argue about the best course of their action. Some wanted to leave the city immediately. Others felt that that would insult Charles, who had just sworn that Coligny was now under royal protection. The surgeon shut everybody down when he declared that the king was not fit to be moved anywhere regardless. But even if Coligny was not going to leave Paris, many other leading Huguenots cautiously relocated their own lodgings to the outskirts of the city, should a quick exit become necessary. Unbeknownst to everyone, Catherine had a spy, Antoine de Beaucharnais, in their midst, who would soon report all this back to his master. That evening, Charles, still fuming, shouted at his mother and brother that Coligny had pointedly warned him that the two of them were trying to usurp his kingdom. Catherine was at the point of panic. She knew that at some point the evidence would lead to the Guise family and they would spill the beans on her. She had to get to them first. And she wasn't wrong about the evidence either, by the way. Before long, the man who had let the would-be assassin into the Guise house had been questioned, and he led the investigators straight to Mauvert, the assassin himself. Given that he had already killed one of Coligny's closest friends and was a known client of the Guise family, it wasn't long before everyone was convinced that Mauvert was the man who had fired the fatal shot. The mood in Paris was now increasingly hostile. The Parisians hated the black-clad Protestants now seemingly infesting the capital. They began arming themselves. Everyone knew that the Huguenots planned to join up and march into the Netherlands, so they were already armed. It was, from the Catholic perspective, merely self-defense at this point. The mood within the Louvre Palace wasn't any better. The leading Huguenot nobles were especially uneasy as the authorities started making the rounds to various places of lodging and compiling the lists of any Protestants within. On the afternoon of August 23rd, Catherine called together her inner circle, gentlemen by the name of Retz, Tavannes, of course, Nevers, and her chancellor, for a desperate war council on how to proceed now that the assassination attempt had failed. According to the memoirs of the Marshal de Tavannes, she decided that the meeting would take place in the Tuileries Gardens, where they could discuss their pressing problems while they walked and decide whether or not to launch a preemptive strike on the Huguenots. They would not be overheard. As Tavannes recalled, quote, "Because the attempt on the admiral would cause a war, she and the rest of us agreed that it would be advisable to bring battle in Paris," end quote. They would finish the work badly begun by Mauvert, although it really wasn't his fault because Coligny bent down at the inopportune moment. But this time, the list of victims would be massively expanded. It would include not only the admiral, but also his most senior Huguenot nobles and captains, so conveniently either lodged with the admiral or around him in the city. This would effectively decapitate the rebel movement and, they hoped, prevent a fourth full-scale civil war. All agreed that such an opportunity would never present itself again. There were also worrying signs that if they didn't act soon, the Huguenots might strike first. Even as they had been walking behind the walls of the Queen Mother's garden, some walking with her reported hearing violent, abusive language coming from the Protestants on the other side, who were shouting, quote, "We are striking back and will kill," end quote. In order to act with full legal authority and to gain the king's support, Catherine now faced the unpleasant task of informing him that she had been deceiving the king all along. She had to tell her son that it was not only the Guises who had planned the killing of Coligny, but that she and the Duke of Anjou had also been involved from the word go. At around 9 o'clock in the evening of the 23rd of August, several men went to the king in his study, where they disclosed that his mother and brother had been accomplices in the attack on Coligny. Furthermore, they warned the king that he and the royal family now were in the gravest of perils. They explained that the Huguenots planned, quote, not only to take the Duke of Guise, but the queen, his mother, and his brother. They also believed that the king himself had consented to the attack on the admiral, and therefore decided to rise up that very night against him and others throughout his kingdom, end quote. Scarcely able to believe what he was hearing, Charles struggled to absorb what had been done. Worse still, he now found himself in the most precarious of positions, with no idea how to defend himself and the realm. Then the Queen Mother and Anjou, amongst others, visited the king. They laid all sorts of allegations at Coligny's feet and detailed the reasons that the admiral simply had to die. There were no other options. At first, the king cried that these were lies, declaring, quote, "The admiral loves me as though I were his own son. He would do anything to harm me," end quote. Eventually, however, the arguments of his mother broke down his spirit. Feeling he had been betrayed by his trusted friend, he began to listen to Catherine, and she outlined their plan to kill all the senior Huguenots in Paris, starting with the Admiral de Coligny. The Bourbon princes of the blood were to be kept alive and forced to give up the Protestant faith under pain of death. Finally convinced, the young, and we have to remember, desperately ill and relatively unstable king is said to have uttered the immortal cry for which he is remembered throughout all of history, quote, "Then kill them all. Kill them all," end quote. It is almost certain that by this he meant all those on a list that had been drawn up by Catherine, and not, as has often been claimed, all the Huguenots in France. A terrible massacre wouldn't resolve anything, but the killing of a select few might eliminate the heretics' high command. The king prepared and approved the list of those to be executed. He desired, above all, that this should be a legal state undertaking. Although no such list has ever been found, it's hardly surprising given its sensitivity. Now, with Charles's approval, the plan had to be put into action at once. Urgent dispatches were written and sent out. The Duke of Guise was given the task of taking his men to the Hôtel de Bassigny and there kill the admiral. The captain of the city guard was told to muster his militiamen and guard all other possible exits from the city, closing the city gates. Chained barges were linked up across the Seine to prevent escape downriver. To protect the houses of the militiamen, each one had an armed guard wearing a white sash on his right arm with a flaming torch, assigned to stand in their doorways. The Catholic bourgeoisie were issued weapons for self-protection, and cannons were placed in front of the Hôtel de Ville. The king's own bodyguard and personal troops of the Guises were to undertake the actual killing, led by Guise and several other men, including Tavannes. The signal for the start of the attack, the murder of Coligny, was to be the bell of the Palais de Justice, which would toll at 3 o'clock in the morning. In fact, the actual bell rang out about a minute earlier, and so the killings commenced. Coligny's residence was only a few minutes' walk from the Palace de Louvre. There, the Guise men pounded on the door, which was duly opened by the servant stationed there. He was immediately stabbed to death for his trouble. One of the admiral's Swiss guards realized what was happening and bolted upstairs, securing the door to Coligny's room with a large chest. But Coligny immediately realized that this was the end. He calmly asked for his robes and requested that his minister pray for him. He made no effort whatsoever to escape. One of the men who eventually broke down the door asked Coligny if he was the admiral. He responded that he was. The man then unceremoniously stabbed Coligny through the chest and shoved him out the window. His body hit the ground, and he landed only a few feet from the Duke of Guise, who gave the dead body a satisfying kick for good measure before riding off. At the Louvre, the killings began around the same time. Henri of Navarre had been in his apartments at the palace, holding an urgent meeting with his suite of nobles about the worrying signs that an attack of some sort was imminent. He was restless and decided that he would speak with the king early the next morning. When Margot arrived, quote, "The king, my husband, who was in his bed, sent word to me that I should retire, which I did. I found his bed surrounded by some 30 or 40 Huguenots who were strangers to me, as I had yet been married only a few days. All night long, they talked of the accident to the admiral, deciding to go to the king as soon as it were day and demand justice," end quote. But the queen, Margot, was to get very little rest that night, for her husband rose at the first light of dawn, having been unable to sleep. He decided to play tennis while waiting for the king to rise. But he had not walked more than a few feet from his apartment when he heard he and his companions being stopped by guards on the king's orders. Separated from his men, the elite of the Protestant party, most of whom he would never see again, Henri was then taken with his cousin, the Prince de Condé, to a chamber and ordered to remain there by the king for his own safety. As he was locked in with his cousin, his comrades were being slaughtered, easy victims trapped in the heart of their enemy's castle. The captain of the royal guard led his men as they began the gruesome work. Most of the Huguenots were asleep when the killing started. Dragged from their beds, their throats were cut before they had a chance to fight back. As the noise of the screams and the terror resounded throughout the passages, staircases, and confusing corridors that made up much of the altered palace, the survivors ran desperately, attempting to hide from the teams of killers. Finding nowhere to conceal themselves, many of these poor victims ran into the courtyard of the Louvre. There, awaiting them, were the king's archers, who pushed the terrified men and women onto the halberds of the Swiss guards, who impaled their unarmed quarry with grim efficiency. Margot had just fallen asleep in her husband's bed when someone was heard desperately banging and kicking against the door, crying out, "Navarre, Navarre." Margot's old nurse, thinking it was Navarre himself, hurriedly unlocked the door, only to find that it was Monseigneur de Lorraine, one of his gentlemen. Margot was aghast when she saw him, later writing, quote, "Wounded in the elbow by a sword and by a halberd on the arm, and he was pursued by 4 archers who followed him into the room. To save himself, he flung himself on my bed, and I, with that man holding me, rolled him into the passage, and he after me, still hugging my body. I did not know who he was, or whether he meant to outrage me, nor whether it was him or myself whom the archers were pursuing. We both screamed and were equally terrified. But at last, as God would have it, Monseigneur de Nancy, the captain of the guards, came in. Seeing me in that position, though he pitied me, he could not help laughing, and gave me the life of that poor man who was clinging to me. I had him laid in my closet, and his wounds tended, and kept there until he recovered. While I was changing my shift, which was bloody, Monseigneur de Nancy told me what was happening, and assured me that the king, my husband, was in the king's room, and that no harm would come to him. Wrapping me in my bedrobe, he led me to the apartment of my sister, Madame de Lorraine, where I arrived more dead than alive. As I entered the antechamber, the door of which was standing wide open, a gentleman named Borassi, running from the archers who were at his heels, was struck by a halberd not 3 feet away from me. I fell, almost fainting, into the arms of Monseigneur de Nancy, and as soon as I could recover, I ran into the little room where my sister slept." End quote. As the feast day of St. Bartholomew dawned, all but a few of the most senior Huguenot leaders lay dead or dying. Nor was the slaughter confined to the leadership. Easily identifiable by their simple black and white robes, Huguenots who came to the city to enjoy the thrill of a royal wedding were now indiscriminately killed. Men, women, and children, stripped naked of their valuables before their bodies were cast into the Seine. And here I want to quote directly, because I think it's a great section of the book, from historian Leonine Frida in her work Catherine de' Medici in the Renaissance, Queen of France. Quote, "Most of the diplomatic reports written at the time convey conflicting reports and often completely false information, reflecting the confusion and chaos of the situation for those in the midst. As the frenzied slaughter broadened in scope, old scores could be conveniently settled, cloaked by the bloody, dusty chaos. It was later noted that a number of bourgeoisie Catholic Parisians had suffered the same fate as Protestants. Many financial debts were wiped clean with the death of creditors and moneylenders that night. Here was the opportunity to rob a neighbor, kill a personal enemy, or perhaps even rid oneself of a nagging wife without risk of discovery amidst the insane, seemingly unstoppable carnage. Libraries were set ablaze, and all the time priests and preachers encouraged the bloodshed. There were a number that the Almighty himself had sent the Parisians a special sign of his approval by the miraculous flowering of a dried-out hawthorn bush beside a statue of the Holy Virgin in the Cimetière des Innocents. Most of the important Huguenots were dead by 5 a.m. on Sunday, August the 24th. Their bodies were just piled up in the courtyards of the Louvre Palace. But the violence continued for another 3 days, despite Charles's ineffectual orders for them to stop. The violence soon spread to the provinces, as I suppose we should have expected. Despite dispatch from the king on the 24th announcing that there had been a bloody clash between the houses of Guise and Chaton, and that local authorities must keep control over their localities. But again, no one listens to the king at this point. By the 25th of August, these dispatches were no longer even credible, and the king issued a fresh declaration stating that the Huguenots had premeditated an attack against the king which had been thwarted. By his original orders, the strictest control must be kept to prevent the violence from spreading, but the commands that followed the king or his council were by no means consistent or in any way, shape, or form enforceable. Misunderstanding piled on top of confusion. In many regions, it was too late anyway. The flames of hatred fanned out all over the country, and many provincial cities followed the capital with orgies of killing. In October 1572, the tumult finally reached southern France, where the last of the cruelty unleashed on St. Bartholomew's Day was finally spent. Yet not every single Huguenot died. Those who had taken the precaution of moving to the outskirts of Paris, by and large, were able to make their escape. And each man, woman, and child who got away carried with them the seeds of more civil war, of more unrest and conflict. Sadly, as we're going to see, St. Bartholomew's Day was only the beginning. But as I promised previously, next week we're going to turn east. And we're going to go back to the Ottoman Empire, because we have quite a lot of catching up to do after the death of Suleiman the Magnificent to keep our narrative somewhat coherent. In the meantime, if you're eager for more content, check out the links in the show notes that can take you to the website. It can also take you to our Patreon page, at which time you can get access to Western Civ 2.0. We're now deeply into the Punic Wars and beyond in our favorite ancient Roman period. So if you'd like to check that out, you can get a free trial. Or if you would just like to support the show, for $1 a month, you can get ad-free versions of the show that come out 1 week early. And I appreciate it, every penny.